Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at this article from News Source Guyana.
Okay.
And it's about a phone call that happened between Guyanese President Irfan Ali and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Right.
But what's interesting to me is how much stuff this one conversation touches on.
Yeah.
We've got illegal immigration, U.S.-Guyana relations, the Venezuela border dispute. We've even got
internal politics.
Yeah, internal politics in both countries.
Yeah, it really is like one of those things where you just like look through a keyhole and you see this whole world of interconnected issues, you know, particularly in the Americas.
It's so true.
Oh.
So let's start with the phone call itself.
Okay.
It happened on January 28th of this year, so very recent.
Mm-hmm.
And the U.S. State Department put out a statement, and they said that they discussed the crisis of illegal immigration.
Okay.
Quote unquote.
Right.
And that they agreed to address it jointly.
I see.
But what does that even mean in practice? And what could it mean for Guyanese migrants who are already living in the U.S.?
I think that to answer that, we really have to look at the context of this. You know, this is happening under a new Donald Trump administration, which, you know, historically has had very strong signals for much stricter immigration policies.
Right.
And in fact, the article even mentions that there are crackdowns already happening, like raids and deportations are already happening across the U.S. So with that in mind, when they say address it jointly, it kind of takes on a whole new meaning, right?
It's almost more unsettling than cooperative.
Yeah, it's not really clear what that means in practice.
Yeah. And it seems like Guyanese communities in the U.S. are very much on edge. The article mentions influencers and activists in New York who are advising their fellow Guyanese to just basically stay quiet and not give information to U.S. authorities.
Oh, wow.
So there's like a real fear running through those communities.
Yeah, it's so interesting that they're kind of taking it upon themselves to spread the word. And
absolutely. And then on top of that, we have Guyana's Vice President Farjag Deo saying that Guyana will accept deported Guyanese nationals. So now it raises all these questions of like, well, what would that impact be on Guyana? Can they even handle a large influx of deportees with their current social and economic conditions? It's fascinating to see how one, policy decision in one country can have these domino effects across borders and across, people's lives and the social fabric of whole nations. But then there's another layer to this, which is the Venezuela border dispute.
Oh, right. Yeah, the Essequibo.
Right, the Essequibo region.
Yeah.
That adds a whole other dimension to this already complicated situation.
It really does.
So during this phone call, the U.S. reaffirmed its support for Guyana's territorial integrity. So they're kind of pushing back against Venezuela's claims. But then on the other hand, Venezuela just recently announced that they're going to hold elections for a governor of the Essequibo region, like it's just one of their states.
Oh, wow.
So that's going to be raising eyebrows internationally.
For sure, yeah.
And then, of course, there's that $25 million reward being offered for information leading to the arrest or conviction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. So things seem to be escalating quite quickly here.
Yeah.
Can you give us some background on this border dispute? Like, why is this particular region so contested, and what's really at stake here?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is one of those things where historical context is really, really important. And it really boils down to the fact that the Essequibo region is extremely rich in natural resources, oil in particular.
Right, I see.
So that makes it a very, very desirable territory.
Of course.
And the dispute itself actually goes back centuries. Both Guyana and Venezuela have these long-standing historical claims to this area. And of course, the recent discovery of oil has just intensified the dispute by adding this whole economic layer to this already complex geopolitical situation.
So we've got anxieties about immigration crackdowns, a territorial dispute that's being fueled by oil interests, and a new U.S. administration taking a hard line on immigration.
Right.
That's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it is.
But there's another piece of this puzzle that we have to consider, and that's the internal politics of both Guyana and Venezuela.
Okay.
The article mentions disputed elections in Venezuela with the opposition claiming victory.
Uh-huh.
And it also hints at some internal political dynamics happening in Guyana.
Interesting.
With references to the opposition and how the non-oil sectors of their economy are doing.
Yeah, so this is really where we start to see how internal politics can actually have a huge impact on a country's international relations.
Yeah.
Because in Venezuela, you've got this contested election. The opposition is challenging Maduro's rule, so it's creating this atmosphere of instability.
Right.
And that instability, it spills over into their foreign policy, particularly with Guyana. So, by asserting their claim over the Essequibo region and holding these elections, what Maduro's regime is trying to do is project this image of strength and unity both domestically and internationally.
So it's kind of like they're trying to flex their muscles on the international stage.
In a way, yeah.
To distract from their internal problems.
It's certainly a strategy that's been employed by a lot of leaders throughout history, but the question is, will it work in this case?
Yeah. How effective will it be?
And at what cost?
That's a great question. And then how does Guyana fit into all of this? Are they just pawns in some bigger game?
Well, they're definitely in a precarious position because on the one hand, they need international support, especially from the U.S., to counter Venezuela's claims on their territory.
Right.
But then on the other hand, they're also potentially facing this influx of deportees from the U.S., which could really strain their resources and create social tensions. So it's like they're walking this tightrope, trying to balance their own interests with the demands of these more powerful nations.
Right. It's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and all this is happening while they're also dealing with their own internal political dynamics and economic anxieties.
Yeah.
The article mentioned concerns about how the non-oil sectors of their economy are performing. So what's the significance of that?
Yeah, so that's a really crucial point because the discovery of oil has obviously been a game changer for Guyana. It's brought in a lot of revenue. It's attracting foreign investment.
Right.
But it's also raised concerns about becoming too reliant on oil and neglecting these other vital sectors like agriculture and manufacturing.
So it's kind of like too much of a good thing.
Yeah, in a way.
It can be a bad thing, especially if it creates this economic imbalance that could actually worsen existing inequalities and potentially lead to social unrest.
Well, exactly. Economic dependence on a single resource can make a country extremely vulnerable to price fluctuations, global market forces, not to mention potential corruption and mismanagement.
Yeah.
So it's a really delicate balancing act.
So to sum it all up, we have a regional power that's struggling with internal legitimacy and using a border dispute to kind of project strength.
Right.
And then we have a smaller nation caught in the crossfire trying to manage its own economic and political challenges while also seeking external support.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating situation, but also kind of unsettling.
Definitely. And it's a situation with potential consequences that reach far beyond the borders of these two countries.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how interconnected things are on a global scale.
Yeah.
What happens in one corner of the world can really have these ripple effects across continents.
Oh, absolutely.
But let's shift our focus back to the U.S. for a second.
Okay.
The article mentions the new Donald Trump administration and this crackdown on illegal immigration. So what are the possible motives behind this policy shift? And how does it tie into the U.S.'s involvement in this Guyana-Venezuela dispute?
Well, the U.S.'s approach to immigration has always been this really complex mix of economic, social, and political factors,
Right.
But this particular administration's push for stricter immigration controls, I think you could see it as an attempt to appeal to a certain segment of voters who were concerned about things like job security and national identity.
So it's like domestic politics influencing foreign policy.
It's not necessarily in isolation, though. Domestic politics play a role for sure. But there are also these larger geopolitical factors at play. The U.S. has this long history of viewing Latin America as its own sphere of influence, and they've often intervened to protect their interests in the region.
Right.
So supporting Guyana in this border dispute, I think you could see that as part of a larger strategy to counter what the U.S. sees as growing Chinese and Russian influence in the region.
So it's not just about the oil, it's about maintaining U.S. dominance in the region.
Exactly. Control of resources, especially energy resources, is a key element of geopolitical power.
Right.
So by backing Guyana, the U.S. is aiming to secure access to these oil reserves while also limiting the influence of its rivals.
This is starting to feel like a real-life game of geopolitical chess.
Right. And like any good chess match, there are always unexpected moves and consequences. This is a fluid situation, and the actions of one player can have these unforeseen consequences for everyone else, for instance. This U.S. crackdown on illegal immigration could unintentionally push more Guyanese to seek refuge in Venezuela, which would further escalate tensions.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. It really highlights the interconnectedness of all these issues.
Yeah.
And the potential for unintended consequences. It seems like everyone's walking a tightrope here.
Absolutely.
Speaking of delicate balancing acts, let's go back to Guyana's internal situation for a moment.
Okay.
We talked about those concerns over their reliance on oil. Can you expand on the anxieties surrounding that? Like, how are these anxieties impacting internal politics and Guyana's relationship with the U.S.?
I think it's a great point that you bring up because it's not just about the presence of oil, but how it's managed and the effect it has on the overall economy, you know?
Right.
So I think a lot of the anxiety stems from questions like, what are the long-term effects of this reliance on oil?
Right.
What does it mean for Guyana's future? You know, if other sectors are neglected, it could create instability and potentially lead to social unrest.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Oil wealth can bring prosperity, but it can also create these vulnerabilities if it's not managed carefully.
Exactly. And those vulnerabilities can be exploited both by internal actors and external forces. And this is where Guyana's internal politics and its relationship with the U.S. become even more entangled.
Can you unpack that a little bit more? Like, what do you mean by vulnerabilities being exploited?
Well, imagine a scenario where Guyana becomes overly reliant on U.S. support to protect its oil interests from Venezuela.
Okay.
This could give the U.S. a lot of leverage to influence Guyana's internal policies, potentially even to the detriment of the Guyanese people.
Right.
It's a delicate balance of power, and those who hold the purse strings often wield a lot of influence.
It's a classic dilemma for smaller nations. They need those powerful allies. But that alliance often comes at a price.
Precisely. And that price could be economic concessions, political alignment, or even compromises on their sovereignty.
This brings us back to Venezuela and their motivations for pressing this border dispute. It seems like they're facing a similar set of challenges, albeit from a different angle.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation because Venezuela's internal struggles are very closely tied to their actions on the international stage. The disputed elections and the opposition challenging Maduro's legitimacy have created this crisis of confidence in the government. So by asserting their claim over the Essequibo region, they're trying to rally this nationalist sentiment and divert attention away from their internal problems.
So it's that classic tactic of using a foreign threat to unify the population and consolidate power.
Exactly. But the question is, will this tactic actually work in the long run?
Right.
Or will it backfire and further destabilize the region?
These are all really thought-provoking questions, and it seems like we've only just scratched the surface of this complex web of interconnections.
There's definitely a lot more to explore, especially when we consider the broader geopolitical context, the role of international organizations, and the potential for these events to reshape the balance of power in the region.
Wow. It's amazing how one news article can spark such a in-depth and complex discussion. We've gone from a phone call to the nuances of international relations, domestic politics, strategic importance of resources.
Yeah, and we've really seen how all of these seemingly separate issues are actually all connected,
Absolutely.
They influence each other in ways that can be both predictable and very unpredictable.
So speaking of interconnections, you mentioned the role of international organizations earlier. What about the UN?
Yeah.
What role could they potentially play in all of this?
Well, the UN has a long history of mediating international conflicts and upholding international law. So in this situation, they could potentially facilitate dialogue between Guyana and Venezuela, hopefully helping to de-escalate tensions and find a peaceful resolution to the border dispute.
So they act as a neutral third party.
Right, exactly.
To help bring both sides to the negotiating table.
Right, and they could also provide a platform for Guyana to gain international support for its territorial integrity.
Okay.
But, the UN's effectiveness really depends on the cooperation of its member states. Their resolutions only carry weight if countries are actually willing to enforce them.
So it's not a guaranteed solution. It's more like a tool that can be used effectively or not, depending on the political will of everyone involved.
That's exactly.
And then there's the question of regional alliances like CARICOM.
Right.
How might this situation impact the dynamics within that organization?
Well, for our listeners who might not be familiar, CARICOM stands for the Caribbean Community. It's a regional organization that promotes economic integration and cooperation among its member states, which of course includes Guyana, right?
So this border dispute puts CARICOM in a pretty tricky position.
Absolutely. They have a responsibility to support Guyana as a fellow member, but they also have to maintain a working relationship with Venezuela, which is a regional power with a lot of influence in the Caribbean. So it's a tough balancing act.
It sounds like this situation could put a strain on those relationships within CARICOM, especially if member states have different opinions on how to approach the issue.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a possibility. Some CARICOM members might prioritize maintaining strong economic ties with Venezuela, even if it means not fully supporting Guyana's position.
All right.
Whereas others might prioritize solidarity with Guyana, even if it risks damaging relations with Venezuela. So it'll be interesting to see how CARICOM as a whole navigates this complex geopolitical landscape.
Seems like everyone is trying to walk this tightrope, safeguarding their own interests while also trying to maintain stability in the region. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of like a shifting global power dynamic,
Right.
with the U.S. facing challenges to its traditional dominance.
Yeah, you've hit on a really crucial point, I think, because the rise of China and other emerging economies is reshaping the geopolitical landscape. We're moving toward a multipolar world where power is more diffuse,
Right.
and competition for resources and influence is intensifying.
So this situation that we're discussing is not just about Guyana, Venezuela, and the U.S.
Yeah.
It's like a microcosm of this much larger global transformation that's happening.
Exactly. It highlights how interconnected, seemingly isolated events really are. What might appear to be a localized issue can actually have far-reaching implications rippling across borders and continents.
It's that butterfly effect.
Yeah.
A small change in one part of the system can trigger a cascade of unpredictable consequences elsewhere.
Absolutely. And it underscores the importance of understanding the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
Analyzing events within their historical, political, economic, and social context is really crucial to grasping the full scope of their potential impact.
This has been a really insightful conversation.
Yeah, it has.
We've gone from a simple phone call to like a really nuanced understanding of the complex forces that are shaping the relationship between the U.S., Guyana, and Venezuela. And we even touched on these broader geopolitical shifts that are happening on a global scale.
And we've really only scratched the surface.
I know, right?
There's always more to explore and analyze and understand. It's a good reminder that the world is in constant flux, and staying informed and engaged is more important than ever.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Yeah.
We've discussed the challenges faced by governments and nations.
Yeah.
But what about the individuals who are caught in the middle of all of this?
Yeah.
The Guyanese migrants facing deportation, the Venezuelan citizens struggling with political and economic instability, the communities on both sides of the border.
Right.
Their voices are often lost in these grand narratives of power and politics.
That's such an important point to remember the human impact of these events.
Yeah.
Behind the headlines and the political maneuvering, there are real people whose lives are directly affected by the decisions of those in power.
So, as you continue to follow this story, I encourage you to think about those individual perspectives.
Absolutely.
Their hopes, their fears.
Yeah.
It adds a whole other layer of understanding to this complex situation.
It reminds us that even in the midst of all these geopolitical complexities, the human element should never be forgotten.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and engaging. Remember to stay curious, keep questioning, and never stop exploring.